Okay, we will go ahead and get started for this webinar on National Service Criminal History Checks and the exemption period. No, I'm just kidding. Today we are not talking about National Service Criminal History Checks and the exemption period. We appreciate all of your ongoing attention to that. I see a lot of familiar names from some of those webinars, all of the webinars that we are running right now. We really do appreciate all that you guys are doing to respond to those webinars, to join, to pay a lot of attention to this. But thankfully, we're here to talk about something a little bit different. We're here for a little bit of refreshment, to talk about building a volunteer skill development toolkit. This is something that I'm actually particularly looking forward to because it's one of those webinars, and there are many of them, where you all are really going to be the experts. And I'm going to share some thoughts, but I know you all have tried a lot of these different strategies, tried some other things we haven't thought of, so I think it's going to be a very interesting exchange. Before we really dive in, a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, well actually let me just introduce our icebreakers one more time. If you haven't already, you can use the map to let us know where you're joining from. Just use that zoom slider you see over to the top right to zoom in on the United States, and then drag the little purple flag you see over to the top left onto the map to let us know where you're joining from. Looks like a really nice mix of people from all across the country, from Rebecca, it looks like up in New York, to Jackie down in Florida, over to, I see Laura up in, I think that might be Idaho, although excuse me if I'm not quite seeing exactly where your pin is, and Allie down in Southern California. We really appreciate seeing that diversity of folks from all across the country here. You can also let us know what program you represent using the poll underneath the map there. Looks like we've got a really good distribution. That's actually, it's probably about roughly the number of grants that we have, equal to the number of grants that we have, sort of proportionally across the different programs. So this should be a really rich discussion, something I think all of our programs have some stake in. We all spend some amount of time thinking about. So I really welcome all of you. Now we're going to get to some of the standard housekeeping questions. All lines are on mute at this time, and we'll keep them on mute throughout the webinar. You can ask questions at any time using that chat box there, and I won't even ask you all to introduce yourselves because it looks like so many people have already done that. I really appreciate you guys getting that conversation going there. We'll be using that pretty often today, so do keep your eyes on that chat box. We'll be having lots of conversations there. If you have any technical difficulties at any time, please let us know via the chat box. If you do that, Amanda B., who is our webinar facilitator, will jump in to help you. Keep your eyes where it says everyone right now underneath that chat box, because right there what will pop up is a little blinking yellow box, and that is Amanda B. reaching out to try to assist you. So if you need some assistance, please go ahead and let us know in the chat box, and then look out for Amanda B. to reach out. Couple of recommendations. If you have problems with your visuals at any time, we recommend disconnecting and reconnecting. Just disconnecting and reconnecting tends to take care of any visual difficulties you have. And if you have any difficulties with the audio, we recommend having the system call you. There are multiple ways to get the audio for this call, but the one that seems to work the best, that has the highest quality for all involved, is if you have the system call you. You can see we've got a handout today on the screen. I'll explain that a little bit later, but you can go ahead and download a little handout using that link that you see underneath that, underneath the slides. This call is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, you can disconnect at any time, and we'll make the recording and the slides available after the webinar. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's talk about what we're going to talk about. Let's go over our objectives here today. We are going to identify the strengths of formal training and also talk about why formal training isn't as effective for skill development, because that's where we're then going to focus. We're going to share 6 strategies you can use to develop skills in your volunteer base in a more intentional way, your volunteer development toolkit. For each one of those 6 strategies, we'll discuss some pros and cons and share an example of one you might use it, and then we'll also be checking in with all of you there in the audience to see, have you used it before, and asking you to see if you can apply some of these different strategies to some challenges you might be thinking about. So that's where we're going to go here today. One thing that's not up there, and this is in particular important for our FGP and our SCP programs, one thing that we're not talking about here today are your formal in-service requirements and orientation requirements. Many of you know that our FGP and SCP grantees are required to provide a certain amount of orientation and training. We are not going to be going into the letter of the law. This is not a requirements-focused call. This is an ideas-focused call, although, as you'll see, many of these can be integrated into your activities. We also recently, I forget exactly when, but it would have been in the last year, updated our training sections in all of the Senior Core handbooks. So all of the Senior Core Operations Handbook, FGP, SCP, as well as RSVP, we recently updated, and you can find some information there too. But today we're really going to be focused on ideas, in line with our trying to keep Tuesday Talks as a space for innovation and creativity, and that's really where we're going to focus today. Okay. So my first question for all of you is, what is a skill? And I'm curious if anyone in the chat box can let me know what a skill is. What is a skill? Just what's the definition of a skill? We're going to be here talking about skill development. What are we trying to develop? What's a skill? I told you guys we're going to be using this chat box. Everybody was very, very chatty when they were introducing themselves. So let's go in there. What's a skill? Kathleen chimes in with an ability. Talia says the ability to do something, adding a little bit more to that. Paula says something acquired through practice, a term that we'll be using a lot today. Pat says something you're good at. Okay, great. These are all good approaches to a skill. We've got this idea of being good, and we've also got this do word popping up again. When we think of a skill, we often think of things like maybe athletic endeavors or crafts like pottery, or maybe an art like playing the piano, or even something that's sort of professional, that's a next level skill. I see Rebecca chimed in with an expertise, right? We can also think of surgery as a skill. These are all skills. And all of your definitions there are pretty good. Ability to do something well, methods that can help people do things much easier. Thinking about a skill as kind of a strategy almost, something you can use to make your life easier. So those are all right on point. And what I like here is I pulled out a definition from Merriam-Webster. A learned power of doing something competently, a developed aptitude or ability. That's a definition I like, and what I like is that it highlights something that a lot of you mentioned over there in the chat, which is this doing word, That's really important, and then I also like that it has this element of competently in it, that has this word about competently. Today, when we talk about skills, we're going to be talking about things that you do, and things that you can do more or less well. I would say that something like riding an elevator isn't a skill, because once you learn how to do it, you kind of just do it. And then riding an elevator is the same no matter how you do it. There aren't really methods, to borrow Campbell's word. There aren't really methods to riding an elevator. It's just something you do or don't. So here we're going to be talking about things you can do more or less well. That's how we're going to be talking about a skill. And now to get just a little bit more specific, I've got another question for all of you. I told you guys we're going to be using the chat a lot today. What are some skills you want to develop in your volunteers? It looks like there are about 90 people here. My guess is that most of you came here because you said, volunteer skill development, gosh, I really want to do more of that. Or gosh, I'm really looking to move people forward in this particular area. So what are some specific things that you're looking to build? What are some specific skills? Things that your volunteers can do, and that is kind of on a continuum, that you want them to do it more, maybe more often, or at a higher quality or consistency. Okay, they're coming in fast. Problem solving, leadership, autonomy, communication, customer service. I see leadership again. Looks like that's a pretty popular one. I think I see problem solving mentioned a second time. Recruitment, reaching out to other volunteers. Dealing with difficult clients, that is probably the one I hear the most often, and I think one that we'll have some opportunities to talk about today. More knowledge in the field. Now that's a good one, Barbara, and that's really important. I do want to mention here we're going to be talking about skills, things that you do, as opposed to knowledge, things that you know. But of course there are connections, and you can think about how people would go out and find information, or how they can build their own information. So we will be talking about some of that. Okay, we've got a really, really good list here. And we're going to be going back to some of these and using some of these. So keep them coming. I want everybody to try to write one down. Even if I don't read it out, we've got 90 people here. I'm not going to read 90 different nominations. But please go ahead and jot it down there because we're going to come back to these and we're going to ask you to reflect on them a little bit. But this is a really good list to start with of what people are looking for, including some common threads: leadership, recruitment, autonomy, problem solving. It looks like there are some common threads here that we can seize on as we continue to move forward. Okay, now we're going to switch gears just a little bit, and I want you to again use the chat box and tell me what comes to mind when I say the word training. Close your eyes and picture something when I say the word training, and what do you picture? And tell us in that chat box. Close your eyes and picture something that you think of when you hear the word training, and tell us in the chat box. PowerPoints, repeatedly practicing, okay, classroom, hands-on, speakers that present. There's a good mix of things here, classroom style, a good mix of things. Lots of you have really sophisticated training methodologies, but I'll tell you, when I hear the word training, this is what I think of, right? That classroom style. When I hear the word training, that's what I think of. And I think this is what we often try to present, and I'll just say for myself, I'm a training guy, I do this too. We often try to use this to build skills, but I think what we're seeing in some of your comments already is that we all kind of know that training does not equal skill development. Formal training, training that happens in a classroom. Daniel says how to train a dragon. Very possible. Not something we're going to talk about here today, though, as it turns out. Formal training has some strengths, but it also has some weakness, right? So its strengths, when we want to get people into the classroom setting, there are things that we're trying to do. Okay, I hear that my audio is going in and out a little bit. I apologize for that. I've been around too much in the room. I'm going to stay a little bit more stationary, and that should take care of that. So, again, training, formal training, has some specific strengths. It's really good for providing information that's consistent to lots of people. It's really good for providing information in a way that you can document that you've provided that information. It's really good when you're working with large numbers of people like this. There's a reason why we do this way, and that's because we are trying to reach a lot of people with relatively consistent information in a short period of time. In addition, it's good for providing knowledge, some of that information that I saw people already mentioning. It's really good for providing facts and figures. I am seeing some people chatting saying that we are still cutting out, but actually our test lines are pretty stable right now. So if you have audio issues, go ahead and follow the instructions there from Amanda B. And Amanda, if I can ask you to go ahead and actually put in the specific information about how to do that, that would be helpful too. Okay, so this is what training is good for, but there's a flip side to this that we all know, and that I think I saw some people mentioning already when they were talking about how they think of training. They've got a very enlightened view of training, and that's great, and that's what we're going to encourage. Because traditional training in a classroom like this, is not so good for individual needs. It's not so good for meeting people one-on-one. It's not so good for responding to specific information. We are going to have a lot of discussion here today, but I can't spend an hour talking about any one of those problems that you guys shared. Instead, I need to talk a little bit about all of those different problems. It can be resource intensive. You have to plan a lot that goes into it, get a room, get all the people together, do a lot of marketing, do a lot of scheduling, and it's not so good at building skills. As you saw when people were mentioning their definitions of skills, there's a lot that goes into doing something that's very hard to translate in a relatively stationary kind of setting. So volunteer skill development does not equal volunteer training. And what we're going to do for the rest of the webinar is talk about what volunteer skill development is, or at least what it can be. What are some specific strategies you can use, all of which go outside of the classroom training format, to build skills, to address some of those challenges that you all just mentioned. And we're going to share 6 specific strategies to do that. 6 specific strategies to do that, and they're up on the screen right now. And if you haven't checked out your handout yet, your handout that you can download using that link underneath the slides, that lets you, or that gives you a summary of all of these different skills. And we're going to talk about them here today. But we're not necessarily going to have time to talk about all of them and I'll talk you through how we're going to approach these. But first, we've got a couple more questions for you. Using the poll on your screen right now, let us know if you think you've used any of these 6 strategies in your training and development efforts so far, before now. If you don't know exactly what they mean and you think something is maybe this is what you're talking about, maybe it's not what you're talking about, go ahead and put it down if you're not quite sure. And let's see who's using some volunteer skill development strategies right now today. Go ahead and take a minute and fill out that poll. Okay, and you can see the responses coming in. It looks like we've mostly worked with peer feedback and coaching, but there's a pretty good distribution of a lot of different things. Note, though, that only a few of these are over 50%. So this means a couple of things. One, it means when I ask you all for examples, I expect to see some examples because we've got some people who've used all of these. And two, is it means we probably all have a couple of things to learn. We can probably all take some different lessons out of this webinar. Now, like I said, I don't know that we're going to have time to talk about all 6 of these, and that's why we provided that handout for you. However, what we're going to do is we're going to let you guide us a little bit, and we're going to ask you to choose which you would like to learn more about, and then we'll use this to structure our conversation. So go ahead and fill out your poll. Which one of these 6 strategies do you most want to know more about? Because what we'll do is we'll use this to structure our conversation. And we'll start with the most popular one, and then we'll move down from there, and we'll see how many we can cover in the next 45 minutes. So go ahead and use that poll to fill that out, and let us know where you would like us to focus. Which one of those 6 strategies would you like to know more about? Okay, I see a couple people chiming in on the chat too. That's great. We'll go ahead and add those to our totals here. Let's share out the results that we're seeing. All right, keep adding. You don't need to stop entering your information. Based on what we've got so far, it looks like there's a preference for coaching, journaling, and incentives are the leaders. Coaching, journaling, and incentives. So we're going to start there, and then we'll move on to the others. So I hope we can get to at least 4 of these, maybe even more, but we're going to jump around a little bit based on what you all want to learn more about. So coaching, journaling, and incentives. Looks like that's where we're going to start. Now, like I said, we might be able to get farther, but that's where we're going to start. All right, and I'm actually going to go ahead and exercise some prerogative here to start by talking about incentives. So we're going to start by talking about incentives. So when I say incentive, again in the chat, just let me know what you think of. When I say incentive, let me know what you think of. Okay, rewards, gifts, motivation, a bonus. Some people getting even more specific and saying trinkets or food. Positive reinforcement, a reward for skill set building. Great. I think you're all right on the right track. And one thing that I really like to emphasize when I talk about using incentives, is how an incentive is different than a bribe. How is an incentive different from a bribe? Can anyone tell me how an incentive is different from a bribe? Are we just paying people to do what we want them to do? Paying them maybe with intangible things, paying them with gold stars, so to speak. But how is it different than that? Is it purely transactional? Paula says motivation. And Paula, I think you're on the right track there. An incentive will motivate you. I think it's about both the motivation of the person doing it and your motive. Because in order for an incentive to really be used to build skills, 2 things need to be true. First of all, it needs to be geared towards a habit. In other words, we can all picture when we drive, right? And when we drive, we don't necessarily make lots of conscious decisions, like turning our turn signal on. Instead, it just becomes a habit because we do it so often. Things like politeness, saying hello, how are you, having a firm handshake, right? Those are things that we had to learn how to do, but now they become a habit. And if you want to use incentives for skill building, I like you to really think of encourage them in terms of building habits. Incentivize a specific action, and you'll notice on the slide that that is also emphasized, a specific action over a period of time, and then hopefully people will develop a habit and do it even when the incentive is removed. And that's your goal. You want people to keep doing it even when the incentive is removed, so you're not just continuing to more or less bribe them for good behavior. And why is that specific action piece so important? Why is it important to incentivize specific actions when we're thinking about skill building? Why is that important? Pam says goal planning. Any other ideas? Paula says it points to personal satisfaction. And Alessia, you hit the nail on the head. You want to ensure the action continues. And Barbara's chiming in there and echoing that. Skills are specific. In other words, you want them to know exactly what they are doing right. You want them to know exactly what they are doing right. Now, this doesn't mean you can't also incentivize general good behavior. That's fine, and you may want to do that for other reasons. You may want to have all kinds of recognition for general good behavior. But if you want people to do things specifically well, if you want them to practice a skill and be rewarded for it, it's not just, hey, Shannon, that was a great job you just did. It's, hey, Shannon, I really appreciate your problem solving. I really appreciate your problem solving, right? It's not just, Rebecca, you're doing a great job. It's, hey, Rebecca, because you functioned autonomously, because you didn't check in with me, you had the empowerment to go do what you need to do, I'm awarding you this specific incentive. So that way the learner can make the connection between the incentive and that specific skill that you want to drill down on. So when it comes to using incentives for skill building, you're going to want to remember those two things: building habits and focusing on specific actions. Now, what are some pros that come along with this? Well, it's easily incorporated into ongoing activity. You don't need to plan a big training to do it. You can just start doing it whenever you want. And also, it can double as volunteer recognition because you're recognizing people for doing a good job. Now, there are a couple cons that go with it. First, you want to include different opportunities to be equitable. So if I'm having an incentive for, let's say, being outgoing in a particular situation, maybe I want people to have lots of interaction with my clients, I might think about ways to also incentivize a skill that I value that's more reserved, maybe for people filing their paperwork on time, for example, or I should say filing their paperwork with diligence and at a high level of correctness. That way, lots of different people with lots of different backgrounds and mindsets can benefit. Also, at the far extreme, you can have incentives that are actually kind of distorting. You can encourage gaming the system. Some of you may remember recently that there was a kind of a scandal in the news about some payment processing issues going on at the VA. And what it turned out was there was a metric that sort of stopped short of actually meeting a client's need. Instead, they were holding themselves to a certain standard of just getting some paperwork filed. And as a result, there were lots of people who got to that stage, but not people who got to the final stage. Now, that's relatively unusual, and you're going to need some heavier incentives than we often see in the world of Senior Corps, where we often are talking about intangible things like gold stars, but it's something to be aware of. So let's think of an example, or let's look at an example. We've got Alexi, and she's running a volunteer program that supports several local food banks. She wants to encourage volunteers to remember to always offer warm greetings when people enter or exit. How can Alexi use incentives to encourage those habits? Go ahead and see if anyone can solve Alexi's problem in the chat box. Who knows how we can use incentives to solve Alexi's problem in the chat box? Go ahead and offer some suggestions. I'll read it again. Alexi runs a volunteer program that supports several local food banks. She wants to encourage volunteers to remember to always offer warm greetings when people enter or exit. How can Alexi use incentives to encourage those habits? Okay, Shauna says, well, she can verbally praise or thank volunteers when they do something. That is an incentive. People respond to praise. People respond to positive feedback. Jennifer echoes that. We're seeing that again. Barbara says reward her with food. Sure. You can say, hey, I'm going to walk around with candy in my pocket. Those of you who have ever seen me train in person know that that's something that I do. I have candy in my pocket. And when I see a behavior I like someone answering one of my questions, I give them candy. So Barbara says, hey, Alexi can walk around with candy in, I think Alexi's a she, in her pocket, and she can hand it out whenever she's someone giving a really enthusiastic greeting. Okay. Oh, Barbara says candy kisses in particular because it says that you love them. All right. Shannon says have a volunteer star of the week and post their picture near the entrance to reward them for their warmth and kindness. And Shannon, that's very much what we were thinking about. We said, well, maybe Alexi's going to have a greet-a-thon, and it's a competition to see who can greet the most clients in a month. She asks volunteers to count their own greetings, and at the end of the month, recognizes the most successful volunteers with a special badge she made that designates them greeting specialists. It goes so well that she decides to repeat it next month, but with the number of times volunteers straighten shelves. Barry jumps in with gamification. That is a very buzzy word in the world of training and skill development, Barry, and that is absolutely right. That is what we're looking at here. Right, gamifying certain behaviors. Rebecca chimes in to talk about spotlighting volunteers in newspapers and email updates, also a wall of fame. Those are all great ideas, but remember, the key is to tie that stuff to a specific action. The key for this, if you're looking to build some skills, is to tie it to that specific skill so that they know what they're being recognized for. And that, so there are real incentives for the people to change their behavior to go after those stars, to go after those rewards. Kathleen chimes in with what is gamification, and Kathleen, it's really very simple. It's kind of giving people points for behaviors. It's giving people rewards, tangible rewards or intangible rewards for doing the behaviors that you want to see. It's very much like this example that we have up here on the screen right now. Okay, we already had some examples of different people using incentives. I want some more. Can we get some more examples of people using incentives in the chat box? And I'm really curious if anyone has used it for a specific skill like this greeting example. And while we do that, we're going to move on to our next strategy. All right, let's check back in with our poll. So we talked about incentives. Let's go and talk about journaling, and then I'll go to coaching. I think journaling and coaching are a nice little 1-2 punch. Any examples of people using incentives to develop a specific skill before we move on? All right, I'm going to start talking about journaling, but I do see some people typing. Please finish your thoughts. We want to see those examples out there. So journaling is actually very, very simple. Journaling is nothing more than written reflection. Written reflection. Journaling is interesting because it is a very light touch method of skill development, but it can be really powerful used the right way. And in particular, it works really well when you have volunteers who want to improve at something. So this is not going to be so ideal if you've got people and you're trying to push them into some uncomfortable circumstances and you get the sense that they're a little bit resistant to it. This is a little bit better when you've got people who genuinely want to improve. And all it is doing is asking your volunteers to reflect on their activities for a few minutes after each session. And you can even structure it more. So I saw a lot of people talk about leadership. You could give them a prompt and say, hey, after you go out and volunteer this week, I want you to just pause and write down a few thoughts you had about how well you acted as a leader. Ideally, this is going to be backed up by more formal training so people know what they're looking for. And ideally, you're going to give them some guidance on what they should be reflecting about. But that's all it is. I volunteered for a long time in a tutoring program, and I know once someone really encouraged me to be critical and to look back on my own session after each time this was a reading program, each time I worked with a student, I started to really find some small things that I could improve that I would have lost had I just walked away and not paused and thought for just a couple of minutes about what I could improve. So all journaling is asking volunteers to write down some reflections. And it's really nice when you can combine it with other things. So some pros, it requires little time or resources, right? It doesn't take much to ask someone to reflect, and it can be done at the convenience of the volunteer. So for example, I did my reflection on my train ride home. I took the metro here in Washington, D.C. from this volunteer site to my house, and I just did my little reflection there. So it can be done very easily. The cons is that it does require a desire to improve on the part of the volunteer. They're generally not going to be under your direct control or in your line of sight when this is happening. So again, it's probably best for situations where you have lots of volunteers who honestly want to improve. And it's also unlikely to result in large gains on its own. It's really, really, really helpful when combined with other methods, and we'll talk about some of those. And it's also pretty good when you're looking at sort of some specific kinds of improvements. And Paula says that they do verbal reflections at the end of national service events. Yeah, you can do this verbally. Absolutely. I like to encourage written because then people are creating kind of a document for themselves, but there's nothing wrong with verbal reflection. So we can consider this, maybe I need to retitle this. Maybe we should broaden this up to just reflection. Thanks for that input, Paula. So let's look at a scenario. FATMA runs a volunteer companionship program where volunteers visit elderly individuals to help them continue to live independently. At a recent volunteer training, when she asked volunteers to share any recent challenging experiences, she noticed they all occurred within the past week. She knows, though, that there have been other challenges that did not come up. How can FATMA use journaling to address a wider variety of challenges? Does anyone have any ideas about how FATMA can use journaling to address a wider variety of challenges? There you go. Sylvia says, ask volunteers to journal the 3 most common concerns. Kathleen says, ask for a specific time frame. Kathleen, I think you're on the right track, but the catch is, are they necessarily going to remember what happened last month? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe, maybe not. Paula says volunteers can observe through their own reflections trends in identified challenges. I think that's a really good point, right? If they're writing down something, they can say, oh, you know what? This happened to me last week, and it happened the week before, and it happened the week before. This isn't just a one-time thing. This is something I need to focus on. Michelle says provide a journal and ask to journal after each. I think that providing a journal is a really nice idea, and that kind of sums up our solution here. FATMA asks every volunteer to take 5 minutes at the end of their session and note one thing that went well, one thing that they would like to go better, and one question they have for other volunteers. And even if this didn't go any farther, just that reflection, you will start to see an impact from that. You will start to see an impact from just that reflection about people starting to really critically consider what they're doing. You'd be surprised at how big a difference that can make. At the next volunteer training, she asked volunteers to revisit their earlier reflections. At the end of the year, she provides branded notebooks as recognition that can be used for these reflections moving forward. I lost it in the chat, but I know somebody mentioned that having people verbally talk about what they're doing, which kind of leads us into peer feedback, is also a great way to build volunteer relationships. And one thing I like about a lot of these different strategies is they have those other connections to other things that you want to do with volunteers, because we know none of these things actually happen in a vacuum. Jennifer's got a great idea that maybe even incorporate a notes section on their timesheets. Yeah, if you're already giving them something, use that. So I saw some examples earlier. I think it's Jenny. It says that she asked them to write notes about the sessions noted on timesheets that are turned in monthly. That's great, Jenny. That's a really great foundation. If you wanted to soup it up a little bit, maybe just ask them some more specific questions. And that can really start to harness people's natural desire to improve, because I don't know about all of you, but most of the people I've worked with in a volunteer setting honestly want to do good, right? They are there out of a desire to do good. Now, there are limits to that, and there are limits to what you can ask them to do. But by and large, they do honestly want to improve, and they do honestly want to do a good job. So this is just a nice little way to reorient that. All right, now we're going to go to coaching, but I do want to put in another request for other examples. We've already had several people share examples, and some people are really taking a good approach, I think, in broadening this up to maybe just reflection more generally. Laurie asks, how do volunteers typically react to being asked to journal? Laura, you know, I can't speak for typically. I don't know of any stats out there. But what I will do is I'll invite people who've done it or done some similar things, including that sort of live discussion reflection, to chime in and answer her responses. And I'll just say from my own experience, I was very happy to do it because I wanted to improve. I wanted to keep getting better. That's just my own personal experience. And also, you know, at the end of the day, the way I just outlined it here, you're also not collecting anything. So you know what? If people don't want to do it, they don't do it. And that's okay too sometimes. Like I said, this is a light touch method of skill development. So go ahead and jump in there. All right, I see other people already jumping in, and thank you for continuing to have that discussion. Let's keep that going while I move on to coaching. And the reason why I wanted to save coaching until after journaling is because I think they provide a nice contrast. Journaling is the lightest touch of these. Coaching is the heaviest touch of these. Coaching is really the bazooka of skill development. Coaching can be used to address almost anything, and there are some things that you honestly really can't do without coaching. What coaching is regular opportunities to discuss progress with a subject matter expert. It can occur in the midst of practice, in other words, while people are doing things, or in dedicated one-on-one sessions. It is very effective for sophisticated, complex skills, and it's actually required for some. Everybody who mentioned leadership is hard, guys. Leadership is really hard, and it's hard to learn in a context like this. It's hard to learn in a formal setting because it's all about dynamic situations. It's all about reflection. It's all about working with people, and we all know that people are hard to plan for, right? If you've met one person, you've met one person. And so leadership is something that you often see being used with coaching because it is really great for those next level higher skills. Think about a doctor, right? A surgeon doesn't get to be a surgeon until he's been a surgeon or she's been a surgeon around other surgeons. Think about athletic skills, right? You could teach me how to hit a baseball all you want, tell me all you want about it, without someone there to actually coach me through and say, hey, this time you did this well. This time, maybe you need to change this. It would be very, very difficult for me to do that. So coaching, I think, is really good for those hardest skills that you have. But of course, that is a con, right? So you're going to want to use it in a limited basis. You're going to want to use it specifically when the time is right, because it does require a significant investment of time from subject matter experts. You've got to have those people around to turn loose on the people that you want to develop. Ideally, those experts also have some experience or aptitude in coaching, because not everybody's equally good at this. So you need some people who are available to coach and who also have a little bit of ability for it. They don't need to necessarily have a certification or a credential, but they need to know how to give good feedback. They need to know how to give good feedback. So let's go to our example. Alexi runs a volunteer program that supports several local food banks. She has recently had experienced volunteers serve as shift managers, coordinating other volunteers who are serving. Recently, she was disappointed to see one of the shift managers angrily scold a new volunteer for a relatively minor mistake. She is worried her new shift managers might not understand how to motivate and engage new volunteers. How could Alexi, yes, we're back to Alexi. I promise you there are other examples in here. It just so happened that we happened to get two out of our first three with Alexi. How can Alexi use coaching to address this challenge? How can Alexi use coaching to address this challenge? Anyone have any ideas? Okay, Kathleen says I've had one-on-one in private with the shift manager. Yeah, Kathleen, that's a good start. But I think what I would recommend is not just one-on-one, but maybe several so that it really sinks in and so that you're able to monitor those skills over time. Okay, Sean is sort of talking about that methodology of pointing out what was observed and discussing what motivates volunteers to volunteer. But again, I think the piece that's missing there is the continuum, is being able to reinforce things, being able to reinforce things over time. So that way you're also spotlighting things that are good. And as this new volunteer, sorry, not this new volunteer, as this new manager starts to try different things, starts to get a little bit uncomfortable, there's someone there to say, hey, I know it felt a little bit strange when you let that issue slide with that new volunteer because they were having a tough day, but that's exactly what you should do. So it's not just about the immediate correction, right? It's not just about the immediate correction. It's about creating a platform for an ongoing discussion. And that's how you can get that depth of learning, of people building new habits and being comfortable to try new things. And I see lots of people with really good suggestions about what they can do within those coaching sessions, showing a positive way to correct things and role playing. Those are all good methods for what you can do in the course of those sessions. But Alexi's actually going to think big because Alexi realizes that she noticed one issue with one volunteer, but there might be others with other of these new managers. And she knows that she's not always going to be there to see what happens. And she knows they've all got different strengths and weaknesses. So she's not just going to correct the one issue that she saw. She's going to use coaching to build a cadre of volunteer managers who she really trusts for leadership. So she sets up special weekly calls with her shift managers. With each one, she discusses strengths and weaknesses and makes a plan to address those weaknesses. And then at subsequent calls, she makes a point of addressing those weaknesses, discussing challenges, and offering suggestions. And what's probably not up here that should be is also continuing to offer positive feedback about what they're doing well. It's one thing to correct a behavior and say, hey, I saw you do X. It'd be really great if you don't do X anymore. And everyone offered really good, positive ways to do that. But the fact is, most of us have habits. Most of us have defaults. Most of us have biases. And if you want to overcome those, often a point-by-point correction is not the way to do that. And you've got to go deeper over time. You've got to go deeper over time to develop new skills like leadership that are pretty complex and that really require ongoing practice and instruction. So, coaching is not for every situation because it is so resource intensive. There's a reason why in this example it's just targeted to the small cadre of managers. But when you want to go deep, when you need a big change, coaching is often your best bet. Coaching is often your best bet. Okay, I think we've got time to do one more. While I go and check the poll, I want people to offer in the webinar Q&A if they've ever used any kind of formal training, and formal coaching, not training, formal coaching. And in particular, I'm curious if anyone's done something over a period of time at regular intervals where they really try to have this in-depth sort of longitudinal development. So let me know if anybody's done that in the chat box. Okay, let's see. We did incentives, we did journaling, we did coaching. We have not done practice, role play, or peer feedback. And peer feedback, it looks like wins it by a nose. So let's talk about peer feedback. I do see some really great chats going on about coaching. One thing that I want to point out is that a lot of these tools we often use, and this is, I'm guilty of this in my example too, it was addressing a negative behavior. But you can't, or you shouldn't just use coaching to address negative behaviors. That was the example I had. But you can also think about it just in terms of encouraging positive behaviors, right? So it's not just when things are going wrong, although that was the example that I used. But even if someone is pretty good and you just want them to be better at a specific skill or several skills, coaching's a really great tool. And one last note about coaching is you notice that all of the volunteer managers might have set different goals and had different strengths and weaknesses. That's another real strength of coaching, is that you can use it to be a little bit flexible and meet people where they are and focus on different things with different people. Let's go ahead and talk about peer feedback. I think we probably roughly know what peer feedback is. But let's talk about it in this way for just a minute. Okay. I think peer feedback is really interesting because of the other benefits that come with it. And a lot of people have already shared some of these things when they're talking about their reflections, Like I said, I think we know what peer feedback is. It's allowing volunteers to share challenges and successes with each other and offer reactions in turn, right? It's using your volunteers as supports for your other volunteers. The pros, I think, are some of those other benefits that can come from it, like building a relationship between volunteers. It's also really good for discussing issues that volunteers might be reluctant to raise in other settings. Maybe they don't want to tell you about something that they did. That's kind of common for people who are in a supervisor-supervisee relationship, and peer feedback can give them an outlet for that. It's also really nice because it allows your volunteers to feel recognized and to use their own expertise and to be resources to each other, and that's a good feeling too. There are some cons, of course, all of these have cons. You do have to have volunteers who can be trusted to give appropriate constructive feedback. If they can't be trusted to do that, you probably need to coach them on how to do it just a little bit. And it's most effective when the program manager creates a structure or a script. So there's nothing wrong with informal peer feedback. There's nothing wrong with people at the end of a session saying, hey, how did it go? However, if you really want to target specific skills or target specific issues, using a structure or a script can help you do that. In other words, say, hey, I want you guys to discuss this difficult client that I know that you have. Or I want you guys to, in your peer feedback, or I want you guys, when you talk to each other after this session, to really consider how you thought the other person responded to negative behaviors, right? You can get that specific and really guide it. So we've got an example here. Han has just trained several volunteers to present a new curriculum in the community on opioid abuse awareness. While the volunteers know the content well, they are inexperienced presenters, and she wants to be sure they continue to improve. However, she cannot attend every session. How can Han use peer feedback to help her volunteers continue to develop? How can Han use peer feedback to help her volunteers continue to develop? Does anyone have any ideas? Well, some people are chiming in ideas. I just want to spotlight what some of the other people who chimed in about different approaches to coaching and how it worked. I really appreciate all those examples. All right, Laura says participant surveys. Barry says a paper evaluation for peers to complete after each session, right? Yeah, we're talking about peer feedback. So talking about paper evaluations. You can have other volunteers sit in on sessions. Great, this is fantastic. You guys are thinking the same way I was thinking. So Han is going to survey the audience, but in addition to that, right, because we know sometimes the audience may not pick up on things that people actually are supposed to present, right? The audience doesn't always know exactly how things are supposed to go. Han designates a lead and support presenter for each session. She creates a worksheet for the support presenter that asks guided questions, focusing on positive feedback and identifying a couple things for a presenter to focus on. At first, she has all the feedback submitted to her before going to the lead presenters so she can ensure the feedback is appropriate. Once she thinks her volunteers understand the system, they start to provide the worksheets directly, right? So she is making sure that the feedback that's given is appropriate. What you don't want is volunteers running each other down, right? You don't want a situation where one volunteer is getting lots of negative feedback from another volunteer. Even if it's right, chances are they're not going to accept it very well, and it certainly won't lead to a positive overall volunteer experience. So you want to create some guidelines, some structures. And so Han here says, oh, it's not just going to be a little chat, right? I'm going to give you a format, and that format will encourage appropriate feedback. And in addition, I'm going to take a look at them, at least for the first few rounds, so I know that people are providing the right kind of feedback. This is just one way to do peer feedback. There are lots of different ways to do it. Simple parent shares are a common form of peer feedback. And also a lot of people who talked about some of the live discussion reflections when we were talking about journaling. It's just another form of peer feedback too. Okay, does anyone want to share any examples of how they have used peer feedback that they haven't shared already? Okay. I see some people typing. I just want to point out the handout that you all have, it looks like this. It has all 6 of our skill development strategies. I said we wouldn't get to all of them, and I do apologize for that. But you've got all the information there in that handout. What it is, the pros and the cons. One thing I like to point out about practice, very briefly, is the difference between practice and just doing something. The difference between practice and just doing something is really the intention behind it. Kind of going back to what we said about incentives. It's one thing to just do something. It's another thing to do it reflectively and to really think about what you're doing and to try to model a specific skill as you're doing it. So we've got 6 strategies here. This is one side of that handout. This is the other side of that handout. So you've got all the information we just shared plus more. But what I want to do now is go back to the list of skills that you all are looking to develop that you mentioned at the very beginning, right? You guys mentioned, I'm going to go, I'm looking in the chat here, and I'm going to go to where we have the different skills. Oh, you know what? It looks like the chat, you guys were all so talkative. You guys were all so talkative, I actually can't access the skills that you all mentioned before. I'm sorry about that. But hopefully you know what you mentioned before in terms of specific skills that you're looking to develop. And I want you to stop and think about which of these you might use to target those skills. Which of these might you use to target those skills? And there's a poll up on the screen, and if you think you know what you're going to do, go ahead and check that box. But what I'm even more interested in than you just choosing which of these strategies you'd like to try is I'm really interested in if anyone is so bold as to share a new idea they had in the course of this webinar in the chat box of something that they can do to target one of those skills that they are looking to develop, like problem solving, like leadership, like client interactions, like dealing with difficult clients, like customer service, another one I saw there. Feel free to remind me of some of them if you'd like in the chat box about other skills or other skills that you were looking to develop and how you might use one of these strategies to target them, how you might use one of these strategies to target them. Let's give people a moment to answer. Okay, Carol says small group discussions. Great. A really good way to approach peer feedback, having people discuss specific situations one-on-one. It also ties in closely to role playing. We haven't talked a lot about role playing, but because I do know people talked about customer service and difficult clients, role playing is really good for those scenarios. And what you can do, of course, is you can string these things together. You could do a role play and then have a small group discussion about it and have some opportunities for peer feedback. These are actually most effective when you combine them. Okay, see, all right, Shauna was thinking the same thing I was, talking about role-playing, but also now thinking about adding journaling to dealing with difficult people, something I think comes up in basically any volunteer context. Jennifer says that coaching is so important in the first couple of months. She might add journaling to that too to help her provide personal support. Okay, so now I get to say, what did I miss? What would you guys like to add to the conversation that I didn't talk about? Are there any strategies you would add to this? Any specific instances of how you've used them that you would like to share? This is also a really good time if anyone has any questions. If you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, Jennifer is talking about role-playing on how to handle difficult children, and that could definitely benefit all volunteers. A really nice thing about role-playing that sort of ties into that experienced volunteers piece is, again, it actually gives some more experienced people a chance to shine, which is always nice, while you maybe throw them a curveball. We didn't talk about role-playing very much, as I said, but another point I want to hand out, or another point I want to mention is role-playing is really good for high-risk scenarios. So, for example, you wouldn't want a surgeon to learn how to conduct surgery by practicing. You want them to be able to do it in a safe space. They might use a fancy simulation, but in our world, role-playing is probably the closest that we'll get. So I'm looking to see what example we have loaded up there for it. We had a companionship program Actually, since there's a lot of discussion about this, I'm going to go to that. Sonia is mentioning adding coaching as a tool during pre-service orientation. Yeah, Sonia, that's a great idea. Right? So it's not just formal training, although that's important, but there's more to it. So let's look at our example of role playing here, because I think it's useful for some of the different things that people are talking about. So as we talked about, it's about creating artificial safe spaces where volunteers can gain the benefits of practicing with more freedom to experiment. You can make it fun. It can be lighthearted. It doesn't actually risk the quality of service, and it's great for creativity. Of course, it does require time and some real scenarios. But the example that we had was in a volunteer companionship program, and Fatma has just shared information about how to identify the risks of fraud, but she's heard after that many volunteers are uncomfortable bringing a sensitive topic like that up with their clients, even though she's given them some pointers. How can Fatma use role-playing to help build this skill? I think you guys are really starting to catch on to this, right? That's a great situation, because you can have volunteers role play as clients, and then you can have volunteers actually practice in a safe space providing this information. So here it's providing sensitive information, but it's also really good for handling difficult situations, be it clients or other people, partners maybe. What's also good about role-playing is it can build confidence. And sometimes for some of these complicated issues, confidence is as important as anything. And so it's an opportunity for people to do it and say, hey, you know, I can do that. I can say those words. I can get over that hump. Okay. Barry mentions that he wants to, here's some other ideas. Barry mentions utilizing the people that will be supported as trainers. You can actually have an IDD. Barry, is that individual development? I'm not sure what the second D is. Let us know that acronym if I'm not on the right track. All right, and we're coming down to the end of our time here. So I just want to pause. I see. Intellectual and developmental disabilities. Great. That's a great example of when you want to use something like people who have some specific expertise. Okay. Last call for other thoughts, comments, other things to add to the conversation, or other questions before we wrap up here. While we wait for those final thoughts, you'll see a one-question satisfaction survey on your screen. Please do fill it out. Let us know how we're doing. It'll keep us continuing to improve. It's great feedback for us to continue to get sharper and to think about the different kinds of content that we're providing. I don't see any more chat, so I'm going to take this opportunity to just thank you all for your ideas and your participation and your enthusiasm. This is definitely the most discussion I think we've ever had on a webinar, and I am very, very, very glad to hear that. It's something that I really value, and I think you all know that it's really where the most learning happens, when you all are sharing your own expertise with each other, and I'd be the first one to say that this is all stuff that you guys have a lot of expertise on. So thank you for helping each other. Thank you for sharing those ideas. We'll go ahead and sign off in just a few minutes, but thank you most of all for attending in what I know is a very, very busy week with our criminal history check stuff going on. But it's always nice to be able to step away from all of that and think about the big picture and what we're doing with our volunteers. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. We'll be going on mute and signing off in just a couple minutes.